This was Baldur's Gate 3's character creator in late 2020, and this is Baldur's Gate 3's character creator in the game's final launch version in 2023. When we talk about Baldur's Gate 3, we often talk about the end result, the scale, the choices, and the confidence of a game that feels impossibly complete. But what we never talk about though is how uncertain the game's future actually was, and how easily it all could have gone wrong. But Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't a game built behind closed doors. Instead, it was developed slowly under years of constant scrutiny by the public, as Larian tried to translate a tabletop game into a modern RPG that actually worked. Today, I wanted to not only celebrate the final masterpiece that we got, but trace its 6-year development cycle from its inception all the way until its impactful launch. Just quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and with that said, let's get right into it. In order for us to understand how Baldur's Gate 3 even entered development, we have to rewind back to the position that Larian was in after 2017. This was a studio that was coming off the release of Divinity Original Sin 2, a game that in its own right redefined what modern CRPGs could look like. It wasn't just a critical success, but it became a reference point. Player agency, systemic freedom, and deep role-playing were no longer out of reach ambitions, but Larian had proven that they could execute them at scale. That success fundamentally changed Larian's standing in the industry. They were no longer the underdog studio pitching ambitious ideas from the sidelines, but they had leverage, and most importantly, they had real confidence in their own design philosophy, one that was built around a systems first design and letting players break anything they wanted as long as it meant preserving their freedom. Larian had already tried to pitch the idea of Baldur's Gate 3 to Wizards of the Coast all the way during the development of Divinity Original Sin 1 during 2014, but Wizards of the Coast rejected the pitch. Yet around the release of Divinity Original Sin 2, conversations again began to emerge between Larian and Wizards of the Coast. Both of them knew that the Baldur's Gate name carried enormous weight, but it also carried a lot of risk. The franchise hadn't seen a mainline entry in almost 2 decades, and it was deeply tied to real-time with pause combat and a very specific era in RPG design. So any continuation would by its nature invite loads of scrutiny and skepticism. But what made Larian a viable studio for the job wasn't just their technical capability in creating large and believable worlds. Wizards of the Coast was becoming increasingly interested in projects that treated Dungeons and Dragons as a living system rather than a static rule set, and Larian, coming off 2 Divinity Original Sin games, had already demonstrated that philosophy in practice. They weren't interested in recreating Baldur's Gate as it was 20 years ago, but they wanted to truly translate what D&D felt like, reactive and unpredictable, into a quality modern RPG. By 2018, the decision had been made. Larian would indeed develop Baldur's Gate 3. For the studio, this wasn't just an achievement or an experiment, but it was a full commitment to adapting D&D's 5th edition into a real foundation for the game's mechanics. The 5th edition was designed to be accessible and tabletop driven, but Larian would find out firsthand how difficult it would be to translate these cleanly into a video game. From the outset of planning how they were going to tackle this behemoth task, there was a fundamental tension. Larian's design instincts leaned towards emergent systems and environmental interaction. On the other hand, D&D's rule set relied heavily on interpretation and discretion. Bridging that gap would require persistent experimentation and a willingness to expose unfinished ideas to scrutiny. The period before the game's reveal in mid-2019 was less about creating content and more about exploring what to make. Larian began to create prototypes to test the turn-based combat and dialogue systems that would support dice rolls and skill checks. The studio wasn't just asking whether making a new Baldur's Gate would be possible, but they were asking how far they could push D&D into a video game without breaking its identity. Early on, Larian made a crucial decision that would define the game as we know it. They decided that development would not happen behind closed doors. Instead of slowly iterating upon the game and polishing it up to reveal it as a fully formed project, Larian wanted to bring in players early. And this wasn't just for marketing, but for the validation of the players that were actually going to play this game. If Baldur's Gate 3 was Larian's challenge of the industry's expectations, they were going to do it openly. That philosophy pretty much shaped everything that followed. Systems were built with iteration in mind, narrative structure was designed to accommodate revision where needed, and even the scope of the game was framed as flexible rather than fixed. Baldur's Gate 3 was never treated as some sort of static project with a locked vision, but it was instead supposed to be a long-term project that Larian hoped would find its shape through friction. By the end of 2018, the foundation had been laid and the license was secured. The direction that Larian wanted this game to go in was clear, even if the final destination wasn't. Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't going to be made as a nostalgic sequel or soft continuation. It was being positioned as a modern interpretation of what this franchise could be, and that choice ensured the road ahead would be anything but smooth. By the time Baldur's Gate 3 was officially revealed at E3 2019 through Larian's deal with Google Stadia, the project already carried an unusual amount of weight. This wasn't just because of the franchise name, but also because of the studio that was attached to it. Like I mentioned earlier, Larian was just coming off the success of Divinity Original Sin 2, and that success would shape how the reveal was received almost as much as the Baldur's Gate name itself. The announcement would immediately split attention into two very different directions. On one hand, there was a lot of excitement that the franchise was finally returning after nearly 20 years of being dormant, but on the other hand, a lot of people had uncertainty not about whether Larian could make a good RPG, but whether they were the right studio to make this one. Real-time with pause combat had been a defining feature of the original Baldur's Gate games, and Larian were now openly committing to instead turning it to turn-based combat built around D&D's 5th edition. That decision would frame much of the discourse that followed. The early footage and developer commentary we saw in the months following the reveal emphasized the game's systemic freedom and the idea that every outcome would be driven by the player's own agency. Dice rolls were visible, skill checks were easy to understand, and combat encounters leaned into verticality and smart positioning. For many players that were already familiar with modern CRPGs like Larian's previous two games, this was quite reassuring. But for longtime fans of the franchise, it raised questions about how well this game would go with things like continuity and preserving the identity of the series. The reveal and the previews that followed didn't resolve those questions, but it brought them right to the forefront. What followed the game's reveal wasn't a flashy or rapid marketing cycle, but a long period of waiting. Throughout late 2019 and into early 2020, Baldur's Gate 3 remained largely unseen beyond curated demonstrations and the occasional developer update. There was no playable build available to the public, and not even a clear release window for the game, in part due to the impacts of COVID-19 on pretty much everything. This meant that expectations of what Baldur's Gate 3 would end up looking like were shaped entirely through what we already knew of Larian as a studio. In absence of any hands-on access to the game, speculation filled the space. Most importantly, comparisons to Divinity Original Sin 2 would intensify, not because the games could be meaningfully compared yet, but because it was the closest reference point that we had. Some people assumed that Baldur's Gate 3 would simply be Divinity with a D&D and Baldur's Gate skin layered on top. Others expected a great departure from what Larian had done before, in an effort to try and prioritize the tabletop elements above all else. I'd say that media coverage during this period reflected that level of uncertainty. Most of the game's limited previews and interviews tended to focus on the ambition of the project rather than execution, mainly because it couldn't be judged yet. Larian continued to speak about adapting D&D mechanics, player agency, and about reactivity, but it was difficult to see how this would all feel in practice. What was very clear though was Larian's intent behind the project. They were dead set on positioning Baldur's Gate 3 not as a nostalgic recreation of the original games, but as a modern interpretation that was designed to reflect how D&D was played and understood in the modern era. But that of course implicitly challenged player expectations. It ensured that the game's eventual release wouldn't only be judged on its quality, but on its design philosophies. By early 2020, anticipation for the game had hardened into something even more fragile. While interest for the game was high, confidence for whether this game could actually succeed was uneven. Fans of Larian's previous games believed that Larian's systematic approach was exactly what Baldur's Gate needed to evolve as a franchise, but many others were still worried that the franchise's identity would be lost in translation. Of course, looking at it in hindsight, both of these sides were looking at this project with very limited information, and were just projecting their hopes or concerns onto a game that hadn't even touched yet. It was in all of this discourse that Larian made their biggest move yet. Rather than continuing to manage player expectations through gradual reveals, they chose to let the game speak for itself, however unfinished and imperfect it was. The game would launch into early access in late 2020, giving players like you and me direct access to Baldur's Gate 3 far earlier than most AAA RPGs would ever allow. It was definitely a risky move on Larian's part, especially for a project carrying the legacy of a franchise, but it also showcased Larian's development philosophy in full limelight. They gave players the ability to test the game, to challenge it, and to question it in real time, and that decision would ultimately alter the course of the entire project. When Baldur's Gate 3 entered its early access in October of 2020, Larian were unusually transparent about what was being offered. This wasn't a soft launch or a near-complete RPG opening its doors early. but it was just Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3, openly unfinished and intentionally exposed while the game's identity was still being figured out. This would prove to be essential to Larian, because although the version of Baldur's Gate 3 players could play in 2020 was recognizable in its ambition, it was far from its goals in execution. To start, I think we should go over the initial launch of the early access in late 2020 and the response to it. Even the initial early access build of the game made Larian's priorities pretty obvious. They were all about systems-driven gameplay and environmental interactions, all with a level of reactivity that exceeded most RPGs on the market. But at the same time, this also revealed some immediate tension. Comparisons to Divinity Original Sin 2 were always going to be unavoidable, but for many, the game was a bit too similar. Previews of this very early build complained that the interface felt dense, and that reading what was going to happen in combat was very inconsistent. Another major concern was that surface effects dominated encounters in the same way they did in Divinity Original Sin 2. Some even complained that reactions in combat were difficult to track, which made turns feel unpredictable rather than strategic. Coverage of this build by gaming media reflected this split in player sentiment. While a lot of early previews did praise the game's scope and systematic freedom, they often flagged issues with pacing and balance as feeling extremely unfinished. But despite this, the game was ultimately described as an ambitious one, even if it was rough in lots of areas. Much of the feedback Larian got from normal players also echoed those sentiments across forums and Steam reviews. A major concern of the time was whether Baldur's Gate 3 was actually faithful to the idea of truly adapting D&D or simply layering its rule set onto Larian's existing design philosophies. What actually mattered though was Larian's response, or rather their lack of one. Rather than issuing a bunch of small rapid-fire changes, Larian emphasized that early access feedback would be collected over time. They weren't treating this as some sort of live service tuning phase, but instead like long-form iteration. It was clear that the game wasn't going to be reshaped overnight, and Larian set that expectation quite early. As development progressed into 2021, Baldur's Gate 3 would enter its most visibly unstable stage. The core systems of the game were still being questioned, revised, and in some cases even quietly reconsidered. As I mentioned earlier, readability in combat was a big problem, and Larian made it one of their focus points. The UI elements were adjusted to better show turn order and reactions within combat. Tooltips would also become clearer, with visual feedback as a whole becoming much more streamlined. Now, none of these changes were dramatic when you look at them in isolation, but together they began to slowly address one of the most common criticisms of the first early access build. The designing of the classes was another ongoing pressure point. Larian would quite quickly find out that translating abilities from tabletop play into a digital environment introduced a level of friction that wasn't all too simple to solve. Some features would by their nature feel awkward without a human dungeon master, while others could disrupt the balance of the entire game in ways that weren't immediately obvious. To counteract this, Larian introduced new classes gradually, often alongside system revisions rather than as standalone additions. While this was frustrating for players eagerly waiting for new content, it reflected the deeper uncertainty Larian had about how to best integrate D&D's flexibility into a rigid digital framework. Although the game was continuing to improve, the sentiment during 2021 remained pretty mixed. As the cycle goes, the comparisons to the Divinity games intensified rather than faded, and skepticism continued to persist around the game's tone and presentation. Looking at it in hindsight, it's funny to think that one of the main complaints during this time were the game's companions. Many people found them overly hostile or just difficult to connect with in the hours they had in the early access. But instead of just submitting to what players were saying, Larian began adjusting the pacing and presentation of the game. They clarified the characters' motivations, and dialogue began to flow much more naturally. By late 2021, it was clear that Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't just being expanded, but it was being rethought at every moment. But if 2021 was a year defined by instability, development in 2022 was defined by the stabilization of everything. The systems began to stabilize, and the core mechanical pillars of the game were no longer in question, but instead Larian shifted their attention towards making it all cohesive. Dialogue was reworked with more dynamic camera angles and performance capture. Facial animations improved, and conversations began to feel much more cinematic rather than functioning purely as decision trees. The choices became not just a mechanic of the game, but emotional beats for all of the game's characters. This cinematic push by Larian fundamentally altered how the game was perceived. Of course, the companions benefited the most from this change. Larian didn't rewrite or change their personalities dramatically, but made their humanity much more visible. Body language, facial exposure, and voice delivery added texture to these characters that earlier builds just lacked. The players' relationships with these characters felt paced instead of confrontational, and this evolution of the game's presentation effectively addressed one of the longest-running criticisms of the game without compromising the integrity of its character. With all these changes throughout 2022, the feedback of players and the media also faced a noticeable change in its tone. Discussions began to shift away from whether Baldur's Gate 3 felt like Baldur's Gate, and more towards how far Larian was going to push its systems in the launch version. While previews would still note the performance issues and some balance quirks, the underlying perception around the game had changed. Larian's newest game was no longer framed as an experiment, but as a project finding its footing. Also throughout this year, Larian leaned harder into reactivity between all of the game systems. The skill checks became more transparent, and class, race, and other background choices shaped outcomes much more consistently. Environmental problem solving gained a lot of flexibility, and the game truly rewarded creative thinking in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. And for Larian, this wasn't about adding more content, but about aligning the game's existing systems to work together. Skipping forward to the end of 2022, Baldur's Gate 3 would receive its final early access update in December 2022, marking the end of a nearly 3-year public development cycle. Of course, in the background, Larian were hard at work crafting Act 2 and Act 3 with the same refinements they learned through iterating Act 1, and the game's identity finally began to settle. Larian's focus was no longer expansion, but refinement of what they had. The systems were all in place. The presentation of the game supported the narrative intent they were going for, and the foundation for it all was stable. Looking back, early access wasn't a prelude to Baldur's Gate 3's development, but it was the crucible that defined it. The game that would eventually launch in 2023 had already endured its most intense scrutiny. Years of public iteration had exposed the game's weaknesses and forced Larian to make hard decisions long before release. And that is what makes this period so critical to understanding Baldur's Gate 3's success. It was a game that was tested and questioned in full view of its player base. By the time early access ended, the game wasn't just mostly complete, but it was confident. The launch of Baldur's Gate 3 in August of 2023 was one that happened under conditions that very few RPGs ever experience. Years of early access meant that the game had already exposed its mechanics, tone, and ambition to public scrutiny. Many already knew what kind of game this would be, so the question at launch wasn't curiosity, but it was to confirm whether Larian had really done it. Within days of its release, Baldur's Gate 3 surged to the top of Steam's most played charts, maintaining a dominant presence that persists to this day rather than just a brief launch spike. This wasn't a typical honeymoon period driven by marketing, but engagement held even as players moved deeper into the game's dense later acts. For a genre that was historically considered niche, the scale of interest Baldur's Gate 3 had was impossible to ignore. The critical reception of the game followed this same trajectory. Reviews from every outlet emphasized depth, reactivity, and true player agency in everything. Many framed Baldur's Gate 3 not as another entry into the genre of RPGs, but as a statement of what modern RPGs could still be when they were unburdened by live service design. This was a game that felt finished on day one, not because it was flawless, because it isn't, but because it was confident. The discourse online reflected that confidence. Discussion between players centered on choices, companion arcs, and just the flexibility of the entire experience rather than missing content like the epilogue or post-launch fixes. Moments from the game went viral, not because they were scripted set pieces, but because they were different for everyone. That variety became part of the game's identity, and reinforced the idea that Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't just being played, but was compared and dissected collectively. As 2023 moved into its later months, Baldur's Gate 3's position solidified rather than softened. It remained a constant presence in the RPG discourse for that year, and its influence extended much beyond its immediate audience. Conversations around player agency, systematic design, and Larian's transparency throughout development made it a key counterpoint to prevailing industry trends over the last 10 years. And as you're all probably aware, that recognition became much more explicit throughout 2023's awards season. Baldur's Gate 3 dominated end-of-year ceremonies across the industry, and even had a sweep at the Game Awards. While these awards can be fleeting by their nature, the consistency of recognition mattered. It wasn't just limited to the game's narrative, or its gameplay, or its technical achievements. It was just all-encompassing. The game was being acknowledged as an incredible package, and not for its individual parts. I also think it's important to talk about how Larian acted post-launch. There was no monetization of the game post-launch, or a seasonal roadmap designed to keep players engaged artificially. Larian made the game stand on the strength of its design, and players like you and me responded accordingly. Looking at it in hindsight, the launch in a way reframes the entire development timeline. The game's early access wasn't something that Larian survived, but it's something the studio used for their benefit. They were able to iterate and revise the game long before its release, so that when it finally did launch, it had already confronted most of the problems that many games face after launch. And that's why its impact extended far beyond sales or accolades. Baldur's Gate 3 became a reference point, not because it reinvented RPGs, but because it demonstrated that transparency and ambition could still succeed at scale. And in an industry that always plays it too safe, Larian proved that depth was not a liability. Overall, the launch of Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't miraculous, but it felt earned. And more than anything else, I think the passion of Larian explains why Baldur's Gate 3 became the enduring success it did. As I followed the development timeline while scripting and doing research for this video, I realized that this wasn't a game that stumbled into greatness. It was one that earned its confidence slowly, by confronting its issues long before release and refusing to rush an experience that was lesser than what Larian wanted. And maybe that's part of why Baldur's Gate 3 has endured the way it has. Not because it's perfect, but because Larian allowed it to become what it needed to be. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.